I've spoken before about how Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is one of my favourite games that I've ever played, and about how it was my first game made by From Software. I've also spoken about how I played Bloodborne after that, and how I personally didn't enjoy it as much. I still really like Bloodborne, but the combat, bosses, story and characters of Sekiro were just so much more interesting to me. That and the fact that I never played the Bloodborne DLC. I know, it's From Software's best. I will definitely play it at some point, but the point is, due to me not loving Bloodborne as much as I expected to, it is the game that I often hear is most people's favourite. I was very nervous about finally playing the Dark Souls games. Fortunately, I absolutely adore the Dark Souls games. I recently played all three of them back to back for the first time, and it reignited the same adoration that I felt towards Sekiro. If you're wondering how recently I played these games, I just beat Gale for the very first time. I'm writing the script for this video the same day that I beat both Gale and Half-Life for the first time. Again, this is something that I think is really important to remember when I talk about these games. I've only played each of them once. Sekiro I've beaten 3 or 4 times, once on New Game Plus, but the Dark Souls games and Bloodborne I have only bested once, so do remember that the perspective in this video is one coming from a new player. I really love each of the Dark Souls games, and I'm really excited to talk about them, to tell you what I loved about them, but also what I wasn't really a fan of either. I'll also, when I finish talking about each game, reveal what I think the hardest boss in that game was, what the worst one was, and which boss in the game was my favourite, just to provide a little bit of extra context. So let's start with Dark Souls 1, or Dark Souls Remastered in my case. I have no idea what the major differences between Dark Souls and Dark Souls Remastered are, if there are even any, but for clarity I played Dark Souls Remastered. After playing Dark Souls I realised why I wasn't so fond of Bloodborne, and it's because there's no shield. In Sekiro you're not really supposed to dodge. There are some attacks you're meant to, but on the whole you're supposed to stand your ground and deflect the attacks. Whereas in Bloodborne, you're supposed to dodge attacks and use your gun to parry. The reason I enjoyed Dark Souls so much and was able to love it more than Bloodborne was because it gave me the choice between blocking and dodging. And because Sekiro was my first, I was more naturally inclined to block enemy attacks. Fortunately, due to the nature of Dark Souls' weaker enemy AI, I was able to use this shield strategy against every boss and enemy in the game. This strategy was even carried over into Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 3 is another story, but I'll talk about that when we discuss that masterpiece later. I often hear how Dark Souls 1 is the hardest in the trilogy because of the outdated AI and worse hitboxes, but for me, I actually found it to be the easiest out of the 3 games, at least for the base game. One very famous boss excluded, of course, because of my shield strategy and the fact that the bosses are not as complex as they are in later games. I actually beat the majority of bosses on my first try. Asylum Demon, Capra Demon, Ceaseless Discharge, Priscilla, Demon Fire Sage, 4 Kings, Iron Golem, Nito, Pinwheel, Taurus Demon, Sanctuary Garden, and even Manus. I beat each of these bosses on my first try. Obviously boss difficulty depends on playstyle and stats, and this wasn't my first From Software game. Both Sekiro and Bloodborne are generally regarded as being much harder games than Dark Souls, but the point is, I didn't have the most difficult time with Dark Souls, yet I still loved it. Because even though nothing is more exhilarating than defeating a challenge, difficulty isn't the reason that I like these games. The Divine Dragon is one of my favourite bosses that From Software have ever made, yet it's a boss that I've only ever died to once, and that was on New Game Plus. Sekiro was my first From Software game, and I was still able to beat the boss first try, and yet pretty much everyone loves this boss. Why? Because difficulty isn't the only thing that people love about Souls games. The other thing that I loved about Dark Souls was the levels, the characters, the lore. It was also interesting and it really drew me in unlike any other game. Neither Bloodborne or Sekiro's lore was as captivating to me as the one in Dark Souls. There was just something so unique and fascinating about Dark Souls lore. Cease's betrayal of the dragons, people turning into hollows, Guinevere being an illusion, everything to do with Artorias. It was all so alluring to me and I loved every second of it. Fighting a boss whilst knowing their backstory or walking through an area while being aware of everything that has transpired there really enriched the experience to me. The characters as well were so much fun to talk to. None of them were as engaging to listen to as Ishin, but both Solaire and Sigmar rank among some of the most memorable and enjoyable characters that I've ever spoken to in any video game. I was so attached to Solaire that I literally spent 30 humanities to keep him alive. I hoarded so many humanities, willingly making the game just a little bit harder for myself, just so I could give my Sunbro depression. However, as much as I like Solaire, Sigmar was the standout for me. He's just perfect. he looks funny, he sounds funny, he's kind of useless without my help, and Dark Souls takes this hilarious creation and gives him one of the most tragic fates that I've ever seen in a video game. I was so upset when I found out that I couldn't save him, that there was literally nothing that I could do. I was so sad. Even though his fate is just as depressing, at least I could save Solaire. That's the thing that I both like and dislike about Dark Souls, is how tragic it is. When I say dislike, I mean in the sense that I wanted Sigmar to live out his life with his daughter. I would have liked for him to have a happy ending, but the world of Dark Souls is one without happiness, and that's what I love about it. It's, for want of a better word, a dark world. This is a dark game, and no matter how hard you try, there is no happy ending. I think the areas in the game are potentially From Software's best, at least in terms of consistency. I remember them more vividly than any other From Software game. I find that a lot of FromSoft areas can all kind of blend together, but I think for better and worse, the areas in Dark Souls stick out a lot more and are a lot more memorable. Now, as much as I like this game, there are problems. Firstly, the boss quality in the game isn't great. The bosses have all aged. Some have aged very well, some have aged poorly, and some were just shit to begin with, but it's an objective truth that for the most part, the bosses in this game have been surpassed by From Software's later efforts. Another negative to the game is that you can't fast travel between bonfires, at least for the first half of the game. I really don't like having to constantly backtrack in this game, mainly because some of the areas are a nightmare to backtrack through. I actually like Blighttown, and even I didn't want to have to go through it again just to get to another area. The biggest problem with the game though is that its second half is noticeably and significantly weaker than the first half. Both the bosses and areas are just not as good in the second half of Dark Souls. Fortunately, the DLC, which you have to beat before beating Gwyn, is amazing and makes up for the drop in quality in Dark Souls second half. And there are some bright spots in Dark Souls second half, but it is clearly not as good. It doesn't ruin the game by any means, but when I say I love Dark Souls, it's usually the first half and the DLC that comes to my mind when I say that. However, I do love Dark Souls, and I would genuinely say that it's one of the best games I've ever played. Before we jump into discussing the black sheep of the Souls games, I would just like to say what my favourite boss was, what my least favourite was, and which one I struggled with the most was. I'd also like to mention that I've beaten all the bosses in each of the Dark Souls games. Let's start with the worst boss in Dark Souls. I'm going to go with a controversial pick here and say that Seath the Scaleless is the worst boss in Dark Souls 1. I know everyone expected the better Chaos, but I'm giving it to Seath instead. The reason being that he's just a boring boss. You just slowly follow his tail and whack it. Yes, you can fight him in a more fair way, but I refuse to get unnecessarily cursed by the dragon. Plus, it is a weakness in his design that I can just hit his tail once, follow it, then hit it again, rinse and repeat. Worst of all, his health bar is slightly too big in my opinion, so this bland fight ends up being way longer than it should have been. Point is, I don't like the boss. He wasn't fun, he wasn't super difficult, and he isn't even that memorable. He's just a boring, forgettable boss. But unlike other boring bosses, Seath feels like a chore to get through purely because he has slightly more health. Crap boss in my opinion. Now, hardest boss I'm going to share between two bosses as I can't decide. The hardest boss in Dark Souls 1 is either Ornstein and Smaug or Black Dragon Kalameet. It's not Manus because I beat him first try, although he is a difficult boss and I could definitely see people struggling with this guy. Ornstein and Smaug took me the most attempts out of any boss in the Dark Souls series. Personally, I think them being the mid-game boss was an unwise decision, as the rest of the bosses in the game feel like a cakewalk in comparison, and it makes Dark Souls peak earlier than it should have. This boss would have been better as the penultimate boss or a later one in my opinion, but that's beside the point. Ornstein and Smaug are a difficult boss. However, I think on subsequent playthroughs of Dark Souls, I won't actually struggle against them as much. One of the reasons I struggled against Ornstein and Smaug is because I wasn't aware of bonfire kindling. To clarify, I knew it existed, but I didn't realise that it was permanent. I thought it was like when you reversed hollowing and when you died you returned to being a hollow. I assumed that the bonfire would return from 10 Estus to 5 Estus upon death. Because of this belief, I never kindled bonfires, so I always fought Ornstein and Smaug with 5 Estus. When I finally realised that bonfire kindling was permanent and faced Ornstein and Smaug with 10 Estus, I beat them. It's because of this and the fact that I faced them so many times that I don't think that they will be the hardest boss for me on repeat playthroughs. However, for my first time, they were the boss that I struggled with the most. The boss that I think will pose the most challenge going forward on repeat playthroughs for me is definitely Kalameet. He's a very fast boss and his moves do a lot of damage. As the optional boss of the DLC, Kalameet is unsurprisingly a great challenge and one I look forward to facing again. This won't be that much of a surprise, but my favourite boss in Dark Souls 1 is Artorias. Fantastic boss, unique moveset, cool design, incredible lore, good arena, nice score. He's basically perfect. And his wife comes to drop flowers at his grave, which was such an effective and surprising thing to see when I walked past this arena to get to Kalameet. Artorias isn't just my favourite boss in Dark Souls, He may be my favourite boss in the entire series. Whilst Dark Souls is one of the most iconic and beloved games ever made, Dark Souls 2 is a different story. A lot of people really don't like this game. It's often regarded as the worst game that From Software have made, with even the most positive of reviews usually being, it's good, but not as good as the others. Personally, I really like Dark Souls 2 and I think it's really underrated. It has my favourite lore out of all 3 games in the trilogy, and I really like some of the characters that you meet on your journey, most notably Lucatiel, who is one of my favourite From Software characters. Dark Souls 2 also has the best hub area of the trilogy. Majula is so beautiful and I really like the Emerald Herald. I also like the score for Majula. The soundtracks for these games are really popular, but I have to confess that I never really noticed them that much, usually because I'm getting my ass kicked, but Majula stuck out to me and I really like that area. However, the game does have problems. Sekiro has consistently high quality for its bosses, as does Dark Souls 3. Bloodborne, at least for its base game, has very inconsistent boss quality. Bosses in Bloodborne are either S tier or F tier in my opinion, with no in between. I still hate you, Rom. And Dark Souls bosses are either meh or really good. The bosses in Dark Souls 2 are consistently meh. There are a few cool bosses in Dark Souls 2, but most of them are from the DLC. In fact, even some of the DLC bosses, which is where From Software usually shine, are really bad. I don't think Dark Souls 2 has any egregiously terrible bosses like Dark Souls and Bloodborne did, but the majority of them are very forgettable. I think Dark Souls 2 shows that From Software didn't really understand what people loved about Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 2 is all about quantity over quality. There are too many enemies, too many bosses, too many areas, and the areas don't really connect together as well as the areas in Dark Souls. Dark Souls 2 feels difficult because there's just too much going on. It doesn't feel as fair as other entries in From Software's catalogue. However, one thing that I love about Dark Souls 2, and is an aspect that is often overlooked, is that the enemies have limited spawns. I believe you only need to kill an enemy 12-ish times, and they won't respawn anymore. I love this because some runbacks to bosses are unbelievably annoying, but they can be fixed by just beating the enemies repeatedly until they never show up again. It's also an effective way to farm. Unfortunately, this does negatively affect farming, as you can only farm a specific enemy a few times. So try not to lose all your souls like I did whilst clearing out an area. Like I said before, the lore in this game is my favourite out of the trilogy. Everything involving Vendrick and the Chandra is so interesting to me, and I really enjoyed walking through the environments and speaking to certain characters. Fighting Vendrick whilst knowing his lore was really fun. Like Dark Souls 1, I beat a lot of the bosses in this game on my first try, but I also think the overall boss difficulty in Dark Souls 2 is a little higher than the difficulty in Dark Souls 1. I don't think that this is necessarily due to the bosses having better mechanics. In fact, Dark Souls 2 is often described as having the worst hitboxes in the series. The hitboxes weren't that bad for me, but I continued to use my shield strategy from Dark Souls 1, but I did notice them occasionally. Fighting mimics in Dark Souls 2 is basically impossible. I also think that Dark Souls 2 has the worst DLC out of the trilogy. Some of the bosses are obnoxious and the areas can be pretty annoying to traverse. However, I also think the DLC features some of the best parts of the Dark Souls 2 experience. It has the best bosses in the game and some of the best areas. But it also has the worst area to ever grace the Dark Souls community. I know I'm speaking quite negatively about Dark Souls 2, and the more I talk about it, the more I realise how many problems it has, but rest assured, I do really like Dark Souls 2. Yes, there are too many bosses, but there is something fun about working your way through them as if going through a checklist. The optional bosses are very difficult, but if you leave them for the late game, I find that they can be really enjoyable. There are lots of areas, and a few of them can be quite short, but that means annoying areas don't last as long as they did in Dark Souls 1. I feel like Dark Souls 2 often gets unfairly dismissed, but it is a good game, and there's enough here to make this game worth your time. It has obvious issues, and I don't think it's wrong for anyone to say that it is the weakest in the trilogy, but there was a lot of thought and passion put in this game, and I do still think that it's a memorable, fun game with some good bosses and areas. It also has fantastic lore and the best hub that From Software are put out. But before we move on to the best game in the series, let's talk about the best boss, the worst boss, and the hardest boss in Dark Souls 2. The worst boss is easily Elena, the Squalid Queen. A cool aesthetic doesn't make for a cool boss. Elena is the worst boss because she's just annoying. She's basically just a revamped version of the Chandra, the worst final boss in any From Software game. She also has this ability to summon enemies to help her. I haven't mentioned it yet, but I don't really like gank fights. Sometimes they can be done well, but when they are abysmal to go through. Elena's summons are also just all over the place. She can summon Valstat, another boss, to fight alongside her, which is the equivalent of From Software putting the middle finger up to the player. She can also summon 3 skeleton helpers, which are manageable but are still a pain to balance alongside Elena's constant intrusions, and Elena can also summon 3 little pigs to fight beside her. If she does that, then you win. I beat Elena on the one time that she summoned those 3 little pigs. I wish she was optional like Saralon and not the gatekeeper to the much better Sin the Dragon fight. The hardest boss in Dark Souls 2 is quite difficult to choose, but I'd have to go with a boss that I felt forced to summon on. In Dark Souls 1, I never summoned for any of the bosses. In Dark Souls 2, I summoned for 3 bosses. They were the Rune Sentinels, which I could have beaten by myself, Lud and Zalan, and the Blue Smelter Demon. In a toss-up between Lud and Zalan and the Blue Smelter Demon, I'd have to go for the Blue Smelter Demon. Lud and Zalan are a boss that I think I could have beat by myself if I gave it enough attempts, but this Blue Smelter Demon is the boss that I put the most attempts into before ultimately deciding to just bite the bullet and summon. I actually like the normal Smelter Demon boss fight, but I think the Blue Smelter Demon just takes the mick. It's a much harder reskin of an already hard boss fight, and I just hate that it goes into its 3rd phase with about 70% health left, and that just being near it causes damage. As you can probably tell, I'm not a fan of this boss, and he was also in contention for the worst boss in the game too. However, there are some good bosses in the game, and I would like to highlight my favourite boss in Dark Souls 2, and that would have to be the Burnt Ivory King. Whilst there are a few others that could have taken the crown, I have to say that the Burnt Ivory King is my favourite. Firstly, you have to go on a fetch quest to collect some knights to fight alongside you. Then when you have all 4, you drop down into a fiery pit and square off against some corrupted Loist Knights. Eventually, the good Loist Knights will sacrifice themselves so that you can put their beloved king to rest. Then you face the king himself, and what a battle. I said that in Dark Souls 1 and 2 I used the shield strategy against all the bosses. That was true for the most part. The Burnt Ivory King was the first boss that I actually had to dodge their attacks, as his sword would just cut through my shield. I've learned since playing Dark Souls 3 that I love a boss where I have to adjust my strategy so that I can beat them. The Burnt Ivory King was the only boss in Dark Souls 1 and 2 that forced me to adapt to his fighting style. I also love his lore. He's similar to Artorias in the way that he's actually a nice guy that has been corrupted by the very thing he sought out to defeat. Beating him is one of the few times where it feels like you're doing the objectively right thing, and I love every part of this boss fight. From the setup to fighting strong enemies alongside my bros, to laying a good man to rest. Every aspect of this fight is amazing. However, neither Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2 can come close to the majesty of Dark Souls 3. Sekiro is still what I consider to be my favourite From Software game, but Dark Souls 3 is a very close second. Dark Souls 3 may even be in my top 10 favourite games. I love this game. The annoying aspects of Dark Souls 1 and 2 are gone for the most part. You can walk between bonfires from the get-go. The annoying half-health gimmick for Dark Souls 2, which was so terrible that I removed it from my memory and forgot to mention it during the Dark Souls 2 portion of the video, is absent from Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 has objectively the best bosses, arguably the best music, memorable characters and questlines, and some of the best areas in the entire series. Whilst Artorias might still be my favourite boss in the entire series, Dark Souls 3 is the most consistently high quality bosses in the trilogy. The worst bosses in Dark Souls 3 are usually the earlier bosses in the game, so are quite easy and not that frustrating to deal with, unlike other bad From Software bosses. Looking at you, Rom. The questlines in Dark Souls 3 are the best in the trilogy. Sigurd is my favourite From Software character ever. If Siegmeyer is a 10 out of 10 character, then Sigurd is an 11 out of 10 character. His and Yorm's lore is so cool, and I loved every sentence that Sigurd uttered, and he's a lot more useful in battle than Siegmeyer. Whilst the Ashes of Ariandel DLC received a mixed response, I really enjoyed it, and the Ring City DLC is one of the best things that From Software have ever made. And a great way to cap off the series. I think Dark Souls 3 is a masterpiece, and it's the game in the trilogy that I'm the most excited to replay. I'm genuinely struggling to think of negatives for this game. Some people might complain about there being too many bonfires in the game, and yes, I would agree that some bonfires are in weird places. Like you'll have bonfires that are only a few meters away from each other. However, I don't mind having too many bonfires. I'd rather have too many than too little. I've also heard that some people don't like the aesthetic of Dark Souls 3. They say that it's a very grey game and that a lot of the areas can't just blend together and don't stand out as visually as other games like Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2. However, I see this criticism as a double-edged sword. Visually, both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 stand out more than Dark Souls 3. Yes, Dark Souls 3 has some beautiful areas like Irithyll and the Ring City, but overall a lot of its areas do blend together. Personally, this doesn't feel like a big deal to me, as I remember watching a review by SkillUp for Atomic Heart. In that video he said something along the lines of how Atomic Heart's areas all look cool and have interesting ideas, but none of them connect together very well. That's a criticism often thrown in Dark Souls 2's face. So whilst Dark Souls 3 may not have loads of visually magnificent areas, it does have areas that all have visual coherence, so it never feels like you've stepped into a completely different world adjacent to the one you were just in. Another reason I love Dark Souls 3 is because I had to change my playstyle when playing it. My shield strategy still worked against basic enemies, but bosses it was almost completely unviable. The Abyss Watchers was such an excellent boss battle, and I was forced to roll away. I couldn't just stand and tank the hits. This was something that continued throughout the entire game. There were some bosses where my shield strategy worked. They were usually early bosses in the game, but some late ones I also beat using this strategy. For example, I beat Gale on my second try using a shield, although I did roll away when it came to one specific attack. The fact I had to change my strategy proves to me that Dark Souls 3 is the hardest in the trilogy, and it was also the most fun for me. Did you know that I never understood what fat rolling was because I never rolled in Dark Souls 1 and 2? Well, I finally discovered the point of the vitality stat in Dark Souls 3. Some bosses in this game require you to dodge out of the way of their attacks, otherwise you're screwed. Another thing that I like about this game is that the ending was actually good. Gwyn and Nashandra were never really fun bosses that I liked. I enjoyed Aldia, but he wasn't amazing either. However, the Solar Cinder is an actually great cap to this series, and the multiple endings of Dark Souls 3 are much more interesting than the endings to Dark Souls 1 and 2. Even the ending to the Ring City is great, although I do wish that there was at least a cutscene after Gale's boss battle or something to make it just a little bit less anticlimactic. But that's a minor gripe. Dark Souls 3 is not only a fantastic game, but also a masterpiece and my favourite in the trilogy. Before I go, let's talk about the best boss, worst boss and hardest boss. The worst boss in Dark Souls 3 is easily the Crystal Sage for me. This boss killed me so many times. Its first phase is no big deal, I could beat it in my sleep, but the moment the clones come out, it's another story entirely. I have no problem telling which of the sages is the real boss, but when they're all shooting at me, it doesn't matter. I just get completely destroyed. I ultimately ended up cheesing this boss just because it was getting on my nerves, and I wasn't enjoying a single aspect of this fight. The Crystal Sage is one of the few terrible bosses in a game filled to the brim with excellent bosses. The hardest boss in Dark Souls 3 is undoubtedly Dark Eater Midir. It took the most attempts to beat this boss, and if I didn't get the Visceral on Midir, then I don't think that I would have ever beaten him. Fortunately, unlike the Blue Smarts demon, Midir is a difficult boss that I actually enjoyed battling in the end, although he was initially very frustrating. The best boss in Dark Souls 3 is actually quite difficult for me to decide, and I think I'm going to give an answer that may come as a surprise to a lot of people. I'm going to go with Lothric and Lorien as my favourite boss in Dark Souls 3. This is one of the few bosses in Dark Souls where my shield strategy worked perfectly. This may confuse you, as I said I like bosses where I have to change my strategy to deal with them, so why did I like Lothric and Lorien so much? It was because this boss felt like a direct response to my preferred strategy. I can keep blocking his sword attacks with my shield and then punish, but I can't keep rinsing and repeating as he'll teleport away and hit me from a different angle, an angle I might not be blocking from. There was also this one attack that would sometimes do devastating damage to me and would be difficult to deal with at times. It's when Lorien teleports away and raises his arm in the air to bring down a magically infused sword. The reason this would be a problem is both the damage and the fact that the lock-on would usually lock off for this attack, and I would very quickly have to find where he went. This made the boss battle very tense and very enjoyable. It is both a boss that suits and goes against my playstyle, is one of the most unique bosses in the game, making it my favourite boss in Dark Souls 3. Playing these Dark Souls games has reinvigorated my love for Souls-likes, and has made me eager to go back to Bloodborne to see if I have a different experience. Plus, after the quality of the DLC in these games, I need to experience Bloodborne's, which is usually held up as From Software's best work. I've spoken about each game in this video, but I feel like I have a lot more to say about these games. If you'd like to hear more about my feelings on these games, then please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to make individual videos on each of these games where I can deep dive into the bosses, areas and lore. I mean, there are things that I think you might be interested to hear. For example, I actually like the Bed of Chaos fight. Why? Well, that'll be in the future Dark Souls video. What do I think about the Dark Souls 2 DLCs? Why is it the weakest? Which one out of the three is the best? That'll be in the Dark Souls 2 video. Which ending did I get in Dark Souls 3? That'll be in the Dark Souls 3 video. If you're interested, please let me know. I'll probably still make those videos anyway, but a comment saying, "Please sir, I want some more," would really motivate me to make those videos the best I can. I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on the Dark Souls trilogy, and I promise to give Bloodborne a fair crack on my next playthrough. Anyway, I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye bye.